In a small town where everyone knows each other's names, dark secrets can remain hidden in the most ordinary of places. Picture a bustling Walmart on a scorching summer afternoon, shoppers weaving through aisles, children crying out for candy, the crackle of loudspeakers announcing sales. Suddenly, a heart-stopping confrontation erupts near the cosmetics aisle. A uniformed officer corners a young black woman and accuses her of theft right there in broad daylight. As customers gawk, tension sizzles in the air and tempers flare. Little does anyone know, the security footage they're about to review will blow the lid off a shocking betrayal that goes far deeper than petty shoplifting. Ebony Green felt the blistering heat of the afternoon sun as she pushed open the sliding doors of her local Walmart. She had just finished a grueling shift at the community center where she worked as a youth mentor. All she wanted was to pop in, pick up a birthday gift for her 9-year-old nephew, and head home to a tall glass of iced lemonade. Her dark, curly hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she wore simple jeans and a bright green polo shirt. Ebony was used to the typical swirl of activity in Walmart: crying toddlers, rushing parents, scanning announcements of deals, but this afternoon would unravel in ways she could never have imagined. A sense of urgency tugged at Ebony as she navigated through the store's labyrinth of aisles. Her nephew, Tyrone, was celebrating his birthday that weekend, and Ebony had her eye on a specific Lego set she knew he'd been dreaming about. She moved swiftly toward the toy section, politely nodding at a grandmotherly woman who shuffled past with a loaded cart, and smiling at a passing employee who was restocking the plush toys. Finally, Ebony located the exact Lego set, the newly released Mars Rover Adventure. She lifted the box off the shelf, checking its contents to be sure it matched the one Tyrone had described. It was a bit more expensive than she'd anticipated, but Ebony didn't mind. She always believed investing in a child's curiosity was worth every penny. Clutching the box, she headed toward the electronics aisle next, remembering that she needed a new charging cable for her phone. The store was beginning to crowd with after-work customers, so Ebony decided she might as well collect all her items in one sweep. She spotted a promising sale on headphones and slowed to take a peek. Just as she bent down to compare specs, a stern, booming voice made her nearly drop the Lego box. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," the voice commanded. Startled, Ebony straightened and turned to see a tall, burly police officer glaring at her with narrowed, steely eyes. His uniform bore a nameplate that read Officer Maxwell, and on his belt hung the tools of his trade: handcuffs, baton, radio. Ebony's heart fluttered in confusion. She'd never spoken a word to this man in her life. "Sure," Ebony stammered, stepping away from the headphones. Officer Maxwell swept his gaze around the aisle, eyeing the onlookers who'd paused with curiosity, then turned back to Ebony. "I have reason to believe you've taken items without paying," he said, his voice echoing ominously. Ebony's mind reeled. She was holding a Lego box, scanning a pair of headphones still affixed to the rack, and nothing else. "I'm sorry. What are you talking about?" she asked, baffled. The cop snorted. "You've been wandering around the store for a while, right? First in the cosmetics aisle, then over here at electronics. Put those stolen items on the floor." Ebony glanced at the Lego box, her eyebrows knitting with incredulity. "This? I'm buying it for my nephew." "I haven't stolen anything." An uneasy silence fell around them. Curious customers halted mid-aisle, forming a small ring of spectators. The officer's hand drifted towards his hip in a casual but intimidating motion. Ebony's stomach flipped as she realized he was prepared to escalate the situation, possibly drawing his weapon. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I said, put them on the floor," Officer Maxwell hissed, his eyes flaring with a contempt that Ebony couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, Ebony placed the Lego box on the tile. Her mind raced. Is he serious? Am I about to be arrested for carrying a toy? Well, the officer sneered. No sudden moves. Keep your hands where I can see them. Embarrassment, then anger, ignited in Ebony's chest as she raised her hands in the air, conscious of the shoppers watching. Her gut churned with the memory of countless news stories about unarmed black people facing police brutality for far less. She had no intention of becoming another tragic headline. A store manager named Alan, whose name tag bobbed on his slightly wrinkled shirt, approached with a concerned expression. "Officer Maxwell, what's going on here?" he asked. The policeman shot him a glance. "Caught this woman stealing, trying to be sly about it, but she's not getting away with it today." Alan turned toward Ebony, whose cheeks blazed with humiliation. Alan recognized her from the time she had come to the store to buy art supplies for her youth mentorship programs. "Ebony, is that true?" Her voice trembled with frustration. "No, of course not, Alan. I have a Lego set in my hand. I haven't even been to a register to pay yet." A wave of hesitation flickered over the manager's face. "Officer Maxwell," Alan ventured, "we do have cameras. If Miss Green was stealing something, we can check the footage." At that, Maxwell's lips thinned, the lines around his mouth tightening. "That won't be necessary. I have my methods." "I saw her stuffing items into her purse." Ebony gaped. Her purse was still zipped, slung over her shoulder with only her wallet, keys, and phone inside. She had not a single product from the store hidden away. Fury and disbelief warred in her mind. "This is a misunderstanding. Open my purse if you must. I didn't take anything." A sense of doubt began to spread among the onlookers, some of whom murmured among themselves. The tension between Ebony and Officer Maxwell crackled. Meanwhile, Alan stepped forward, keeping his voice level. "Officer, maybe we can go to the security office. We'll check her bag there, away from the crowd, and review the footage." Reluctantly, Maxwell nodded. "Fine," he growled. "Let's get this over with. I don't have all day." Escorted by the manager and the watchful eyes of customers, Ebony followed Officer Maxwell through the store. Her heart beat with a mixture of anger and fear as they wove past racks of clothing and through a grey door labelled "Employees Only." Once inside, Alan led them into a cramped office filled with monitors and an aging computer console. A younger security guard, Chris, looked startled to see them barge in. Can I help you?" he asked hesitantly. Officer Maxwell stomped forward, crossing his arms. "We need the footage from the last 30 minutes, focusing on this suspect," he said, jerking his thumb in Ebony's direction. Ebony's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I want you to show everything from the moment I walked in to right now." "I haven't stolen a thing." Chris glanced at Alan for confirmation. Receiving a nod, he tapped at the keyboard, pulling up the relevant security feeds. The black and white footage jumped across different angles of the store, some from high vantage points in the corners, others near the self-checkout lanes, and one near the electronics section. They could clearly see Ebony entering the store, taking a direct route to the toy aisle, scanning the Lego boxes, and selecting the Mars Rover Adventure set. Then the footage switched to Ebony meandering through different aisles, eventually stopping at electronics to look at headphones. At no point did she appear to slip anything into her purse. She simply carried the Lego box in one hand while occasionally checking her phone or looking at price tags. The entire time, Ebony's purse stayed zipped at her side. Alan frowned, turning to Officer Maxwell. "She's not taking anything. Looks like an ordinary shopper to me." Officer Maxwell's brow furrowed and his jaw tightened as if he were growing agitated. "That's only half the story," he said stubbornly. "Let's check the cosmetics aisle feed." "I saw her pocket some items there." Chris complied, switching to a camera that captured rows of cosmetics. The video revealed Ebony glancing at some lotions and picking up a face cream, but she put it back before walking away empty-handed. By then, Ebony's anger had begun to eclipse her fear. "What exactly did you see me steal, Officer Maxwell?" she demanded, her voice trembling with pent-up frustration. "Show me on that footage where I allegedly took anything." Beads of sweat collected on the policeman's forehead. The small group in the office stood in tense silence. The footage revealed no wrongdoing by Ebony whatsoever. Officer Maxwell's story was collapsing before their eyes. Alan breathed a sigh of relief and turned to Ebony. "I'm sorry about this. It's clear you haven't done anything wrong." Ebony nodded curtly, relieved to be vindicated, but anger still pulsed in her veins, and she was determined not to let this slide. "Yes, I know. The question is, why did this officer target me? Why did he say he saw me stealing when it's obvious I didn't?" Officer Maxwell's eyes darted to the security guard, who was about to switch the feed to another angle. "Look," Maxwell snarled, "maybe I made a mistake, but it was an honest one. People like her—" He cut himself off abruptly, but the words hung in the air, charged with the implication. Ebony froze. "People like me?" she repeated, her tone incredulous, her jaw clenched. "Say it. You mean black people, don't you?" A suffocating hush descended on the room. Maxwell's stare was cold as ice. But in that moment, Ebony felt the weight of 1,000 years of racial prejudice pressing down on her. She clenched her fists, determined to keep her composure. "Let's just drop it," Maxwell grumbled, turning for the door. "She's free to go." "Hold on," Ebony interjected, her voice burning with controlled fury. "I'm not walking out of here like nothing happened. You humiliated me, tried to accuse me of a crime I didn't commit, and basically admitted your reason for suspecting me is because of my race. I want an apology, at the very least." The policeman stiffened, but before he could speak, Chris gasped, pointing at the screen. "Hey, wait a minute, look at this." Startled, they all turned to the monitor. Chris had cued a different timestamp from earlier that day. The camera, mounted near the staff break room, showed a figure in a uniform rummaging through a box labeled Store Returns. The figure carefully extracted a shiny black smartphone, glancing around nervously before slipping it into a duffel bag. The figure turned his face directly toward the camera, and there was no mistaking the features. The man on screen was Officer Maxwell. Ebony's jaw dropped. Alan's eyes practically popped out of his head. The office fell into stunned silence, and Maxwell inhaled sharply as the color drained from his face. "That," Maxwell sputtered, glancing around, his bravado gone. "That was a misunderstanding. It was evidence from another case. I was checking it." But the footage continued, revealing Maxwell carefully rifling through what looked like returned electronics. He placed a small camera in his bag too. There was no official protocol, no store employee with him. He simply removed items and slipped away. Alan turned to Chris, his voice shaky. "Is this from today?" Chris nodded slowly. "Timestamp says about 2 hours ago." Ebony's eyes locked on Maxwell. "You accused me of stealing? Meanwhile, you were back here helping yourself to the store's property?" Maxwell's features contorted with panic. Without warning, he lunged for the computer. Chris yelped as Maxwell's large hand shoved him aside. "Stay out of my way!" Maxwell roared, trying to delete the footage. But Ebony's reflexes kicked in. She slammed her hand onto Maxwell's shoulder and yanked him backward with surprising force. "She's assaulting me," Maxwell bellowed, but Ebony refused to let him tamper with the evidence. Alan leapt in, grabbing Maxwell's other arm. The policeman swung wildly, elbowing Ebony in the ribs. Pain shot through her side, and she released her grip momentarily, staggering back. Chris, trembling, jabbed at an emergency button on the wall that summoned store security and, by extension, more local police. Within minutes, 2 uniformed Walmart security guards burst into the cramped office. The sight of Maxwell thrashing caused them to freeze in confusion, but Ebony seized the moment to speak up, pointing at the screen. "He's trying to destroy evidence. He stole store property." Maxwell tried to sputter a defense, but it came out incoherent. The store security officers approached cautiously. "Officer Maxwell, just calm down," one of them said. But Maxwell was beyond calm. Realizing he'd been caught red-handed, he made a desperate attempt to flee. He shoved Alan aside, nearly toppling him into the wall, and sprinted for the door. Ebony, adrenaline surging, raced after him, but he was quick. She burst out into the hallway, just in time to see Maxwell barreling toward the exit that led back into the public shopping area. Chaos erupted in the store as the fleeing cop nearly collided with startled customers. A mother with a stroller yanked her child out of the way, and a startled clerk dropped a stack of T-shirts. People gasped and jumped back, alarmed by the sight of a uniformed officer running at full tilt toward the front. Ebony was hot on his heels, her lungs burning. Despite the bruise forming on her ribs, she was fueled by righteous anger and the knowledge that Maxwell's crime had to be stopped. Alan and Chris trailed behind, yelling for security to stop the officer, but he was still moving too fast. "Stop him!" Ebony shouted, her voice echoing through the store. She could see a wave of confusion spreading as shoppers and Walmart employees scrambled to figure out what was happening. In the distance, near the large glass entrance, she caught sight of two local police officers stepping into the store, responding to the earlier alarm. When they saw Maxwell charging at them, they froze in shock. "What's going on?" one of the arriving officers demanded, raising his arms to block Maxwell's path. Maxwell lurched to a halt, panting. Sweat dripped down his temples as he fumbled for words. "It's all a misunderstanding. They attacked me in the back room. Within seconds, Ebony, Alan, and Chris arrived, breathless." Ebony pointed an accusing finger. "He's lying. Check the security footage. He's been stealing from the store. He tried to frame me for theft to cover up his own crimes." Alan placed a hand on Ebony's shoulder. "Officer Maxwell assaulted both of us in the security office," he added urgently. "He even tried to delete the footage." A swirl of baffled expressions passed across the two new officers' faces. This was beyond anything they'd expected when they responded to a mundane call. Cautiously, they approached Maxwell, noticing how unhinged he seemed, the beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Officer Maxwell," one policeman began, "I think we all need to step into the back and sort this out." "No way," Maxwell snarled, his voice wavering. His eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but it was futile. He was boxed in by employees, customers, and now the police. A hush settled over the store as everyone watched the standoff. Finally, with a shaky sigh, Maxwell realized he had no options left. He raised his hands to his sides, allowing the newly arrived officers to approach and take his arms gently. The sense of heartbreak and astonishment was palpable in the air. "This can't be real," Ebony thought bitterly. An officer sworn to protect and serve, stooping to such depravity and targeting me just because of the color of my skin. The two officers led Maxwell, now handcuffed, to the back office, where store security replayed the incriminating footage in front of them. Maxwell's face twisted into a mask of shame and frustration. He tried a final, desperate explanation. It's complicated. I got stuck in some gambling debts. I just needed the money. It was easy pickings, and I never liked the way people like her," he jerked his head at Ebony, "get away with flaunting themselves in public spaces." Ebony's stomach churned. The depth of his bigotry was on naked display. Even in his confession, he managed to hurl a racial insult. But any sorrow she might have felt for Maxwell's plight vanished beneath her anger at his prejudice and his corruption. The officers exchanged grim looks. One of them shook his head. "Maxwell, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." He recited the Miranda rights while Ebony, Alan, and Chris watched in stunned relief as Maxwell was led away, his eyes burning with bitterness and regret. An hour later, Ebony sat in a chair in the store's break room, sipping from a plastic cup of water. Alan hovered by her side, offering an ice pack for her bruised ribs. Chris paced anxiously, eyes still wide from the unfolding drama. "I'm so sorry this happened," Alan murmured, pushing a trembling hand through his graying hair. "This never should have happened." Ebony pressed the ice pack to her side and tried to steady her breathing. "I appreciate you speaking up. You both helped expose the truth. But I can't help thinking how easily this could have gone wrong. If there were no cameras, or if Maxwell had succeeded in tampering with the footage, or if the other officers believed him over me." She trailed off, her voice quivering with the weight of what-ifs. Chris nodded solemnly. "I'm just glad we saw everything in time, and you were brave to stand up to him." Half an hour later, Ebony left the store, the Lego set paid for and nestled in a shopping bag. Alan had insisted she not pay for it, offering it as a gesture of apology, but Ebony politely declined, not wanting to accept charity. Instead, the store manager gave her a gift card as a peace offering, and Ebony accepted it after some hesitation. She stepped outside into the fading daylight, her emotions a chaotic mix of relief and lingering anger. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. News of the incident spread through the community like wildfire. Local reporters interviewed Ebony about her experience. Social media platforms lit up with condemnation for Officer Maxwell's actions and praise for Ebony's courage. A short video taken by a bystander at Walmart, capturing Maxwell's initial confrontation with Ebony in the electronics aisle, went viral. In the footage, Ebony's trembling voice could be heard standing up for herself. "I didn't steal anything. Check my purse." That line, delivered with quiet dignity while Maxwell sneered in the background, resonated with thousands of viewers across the country. People from all walks of life commented on Ebony's bravery, how easily the situation could have escalated into violence, and how the real thief turned out to be the very officer who falsely accused her. Meanwhile, Maxwell faced a spiral of consequences. He was fired from the police department the day after his arrest. No amount of departmental loyalty could excuse blatant theft and bigotry. Soon after, multiple charges were filed against him: theft, assault, evidence tampering, and misconduct. In a press conference, the police chief expressed deep regret, acknowledging that Maxwell's actions were a disgrace and affirming the department would cooperate fully with the investigation. But Ebony still felt restless. Though Maxwell was behind bars awaiting trial, she knew the scars of that day would not fade easily. Racism was bigger than one man, and Ebony had experienced the terrifying reality of what could happen when someone in power acted on prejudice. She decided to take action by leveraging her sudden media attention to highlight systemic issues. She reached out to the local chapter of the NAACP, hoping to channel her story into a catalyst for change. They invited her to speak at a forum addressing racial profiling and police accountability. Standing on a modest wooden stage in a community center filled with folding chairs, Ebony spoke from the heart. She recounted the humiliation of being publicly accused, the fear of watching Maxwell's hand drift toward his holster, and the sense of vindication when the security footage turned the tables. Her words were electrifying, especially when she insisted that accountability must go beyond one fired officer. The small crowd rose to its feet in applause, many cheering her on to seek justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been targeted because of the color of their skin. Bolstered by community support, Ebony filed a civil lawsuit against the city and the police department. She argued that their training and oversight had failed spectacularly, creating conditions for Maxwell to act on his prejudices. Some city officials tried to minimize the incident, calling it an isolated case of one bad apple. But Ebony stood firm. She demanded reforms, better screening, mandatory de-escalation training, and immediate disciplinary measures for officers with a history of racist conduct. Throughout this battle, Ebony found herself uplifted by strangers who recognized her on the street and thanked her for her courage. Yet, she also discovered pockets of hostility, people who believed she was blowing the situation out of proportion, or that Maxwell's real crime was theft, not racism. Anonymous threats surfaced online. A few hate-filled messages slithered into her email inbox, with vile language attacking her race and her character. The negativity weighed on her, but Ebony stayed focused. She reminded herself of the children she mentored every day at the community center, kids like her nephew, Tyrone, who looked to her for an example of resilience and justice. She would not let them down. Finally, the day of Maxwell's trial arrived. The courthouse buzzed with media and curious onlookers. Ebony took the stand, her heart pounding in her chest, to recount every detail. She described the fear, the public humiliation, and the emotional toll. The prosecution showed the security camera clips of Ebony's innocent shopping trip and the separate footage of Maxwell pocketing store returns. They played the audio of his verbal abuse, in which he referred to Ebony as people like her, implying a racial bias. When Maxwell took the stand, he looked gaunt and haunted. His defense team tried to paint him as a stressed individual caught up in financial hardship. They claimed Ebony's accusation of racism was an exaggeration, an attempt to sway the court's sympathies. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Maxwell's own meltdown in the store, caught by multiple phone cameras, only cemented the case against him. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all major charges. The judge sentenced Maxwell to a prison term for theft, assault, and abuse of power, making an example of his betrayal of the public trust. In a packed courtroom, Ebony felt both relief and a profound sadness. She'd never savored the idea of someone going to prison, but accountability was necessary. Meanwhile, Ebony's civil suit against the city was settled out of court. The police department agreed to implement new training protocols and pay a settlement, a portion of which Ebony earmarked for local community programs. Though the settlement couldn't erase the trauma, she took solace in the hope that real changes might protect future citizens from experiencing a situation like hers. In the months that followed, Ebony found her life had transformed. She became something of a local icon, an advocate for social justice who had turned her personal ordeal into a platform for reform. Publications such as the New York Times and major online outlets covered her story, shining a national spotlight on policing and racism in small-town America. Interviews piled up, and Ebony juggled her new responsibilities with her ongoing work at the youth center. At times, she felt overwhelmed. After all, she was just a woman who wanted to buy a Lego set for her nephew's birthday. She never asked to become a symbol or a spokesperson, but she recognized a responsibility, an opportunity, really to confront institutional racism. She embraced it for the sake of those who'd faced similar or worse fates, but hadn't had the evidence or the platform to speak out. One evening, Ebony hosted a small party at her house, celebrating Tyrone's 10th birthday a year later. The living room overflowed with bright balloons, laughter, and the scent of home-cooked food. Tyrone, now beaming with excitement, showed Ebony the new Lego sets he'd gotten from friends and family. In a corner, Ebony's mother, aunt, and cousins chatted about how proud they were of her. Occasionally, the conversation turned to how the community had changed in the wake of Ebony's fight. The local police department's new training programs were in effect, and many officers had personally reached out to Ebony, apologizing for Maxwell's behavior and committing to doing better. Even so, Ebony knew the struggle was far from over. True transformation would require sustained effort and vigilance from everyone involved. But as she looked around her living room, the swirling chaos of colorful balloons reflected in the eyes of jubilant children, she felt a steady, hopeful warmth spreading through her chest. In that moment, Ebony reflected on the harrowing journey that had brought her here: a racist accusation in a Walmart, a heated confrontation, security footage that laid bare a shocking confession, and a subsequent wave of public outcry that led to an indictment, reforms, and her new role as an activist. She marveled at the unpredictability of life, how a routine errand to pick up a gift could spark such a far-reaching chain of events. And somewhere behind bars, Officer Maxwell had ample time to ponder his own downfall, haunted by the knowledge that he'd orchestrated his own demise in the most public and humiliating way possible. His racism and greed, once so carefully hidden, had been laid bare for the entire world to see. His punishment, both legal and karmic, was the inevitable outcome of his own hateful deeds. For Ebony, the experience, though traumatic, became a clarion call. She used her voice to champion others, to advocate for laws that ensure transparency and accountability. She refused to be just another statistic or cautionary tale. Instead, she became a beacon of resilience. Through her pain, she found a mission that stretched beyond her personal vindication: the pursuit of justice and equality for all. If you found yourself drawn into Ebony's dramatic fight for justice, imagine how many more untold stories are out there: people who never had a camera running when they needed it most, or a manager and security guard brave enough to speak out. Her tale reminds us that sometimes life's most unexpected challenges can spark meaningful change, but only when we refuse to back down in the face of injustice. Ebony chose truth over fear, and in doing so, she not only cleared her name, but shone a spotlight on deep-rooted inequalities that affect us all. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can amplify voices like Ebony's, champion accountability, and pave the way for lasting justice in our communities. Thank you for watching, and remember, your support makes these stories matter.